Let's go over a few points about The Veldt by Ray Bradbury. This story was originally published in a magazine in 1950, but it became much better known when it was included in a work that Bradbury published in 1951. The work was a collection of short stories called The Illustrated Man. And the frame story for that group of short stories was that a gentleman encountered a man who was tattooed from head to toe. And at night, the tattoos would come alive and act out various scenarios. And the stories in The Illustrated Man represent the scenarios that the tattoos acted out. So there was kind of a frame story put around put around tattoos. Sorry about that. Put around a group of stories that were related in that they were science fiction slash horror, but otherwise were not directly related. So it's a cool frame story, and it's a great book of short stories. If you're into science fiction and horror at all, if you have a chance, I recommend that you read The Illustrated Man, as well as other works by Ray Bradbury. He's really a very, very good author and is highly beloved by people who are into science fiction and horror. Okay, let's start with just a basic overview of the story. We learned from Whisker that the evil that creates domestic horror can rise from both spaces and people. And in this story, we definitely see both. The children are a source of horror because a lack of parental authority has created in them an unacceptable feeling of entitlement. And as we're going to discuss, that ultimately is what leads them to kill their parents. And as we're going to discuss, parents are a source of horror because they have given in to their children, partially to avoid confrontation or discomfort. As Whisker states, we as humans in the real world, contribute to domestic horror by buying into the dream that the perfect home and family are possible. And we don't want to admit, even to ourselves, that our home and family fall short of that goal of perfection. George and Lydia are clearly vested in this dream. And it certainly appears that up until the point of life that is presented in our story, they've avoided asking themselves some pretty hard questions about how they were raising their children and the effect that the high-tech houses had on all of them. And of course, there's the fact that the family's reliance on their home's high-tech capabilities becomes a source of horror because it has deprived them to some degree of a meaningful existence and created a definite dependency on the horror. And yet, even at that, they're reluctant to turn off even just the nursery, much less the whole house. And they already know that the nursery is not only ill-advised, but actually dangerous. Okay, now we're going to talk about the various layers of domestic horror in this story, but obviously there are surface horrors in it. No matter how deeply we want to delve into some of the underlying messages of a horror story, if there isn't surface horror, it's not horror. So let's look at the surface horror that's in this story first. First of all, there's a horror at the idea of being eaten by lions in your own home. Now, first of all, animal attacks are particularly unpleasant in terms of ways to die. A lot of times, people who are attacked by animals are dismembered or disemboweled while the people are still alive and even conscious. It's a particularly horrifying situation because, of course, animals can't be reasoned with. And in terms of wild animals such as these lions, they're large and powerful and virtually impossible for a human being without a weapon to fight off. Their ferocity is absolutely unmatched by anything humans can do. You know, humans think that we rule the planet. But when it comes right down to it, we don't stand a chance in a direct physical combat with a sizable wild animal. It's one of the reasons that people created homes and shelters to begin with, is to protect us from wild animals. So it's difficult to imagine anything that would defamiliarize a home more than the presence of wild animals that homes were invented to protect us from to begin with. Now, as Whisker says, one thing that makes domestic horror so horrible is that it is often committed by people that we trust the most. We don't expect our family members, with whom we tend to be really relaxed and vulnerable, to kill us. And that's really multiplied when it comes to our children. Because, for one thing, we forget our own childhoods. And we believe that children aren't capable of that level of violence. Of course, they are. And if we think back to our own childhood and things that we felt when we were young, and things that we heard other kids our age say, it might dawn on us that if children knew how little legal trouble they could get into for killing someone, more of them might do it. It's not because they're evil. It's simply because of the way the human brain and human emotions develop and the time that it takes for it to develop. Okay, let's turn to some specific sources of horror, and we're going to start off with the house. The house in the Veldt is a good example of a space that contributes to the evil that gives rise to horror. First, of course, it is an example of what Whisker talks about when she notes that horror is created when the familiar is defamiliarized. George and Lydia seem to have been somewhat uncomfortable by their dependency on the technology even before the opening of the story. But until Lydia notes at the very beginning of the work that something seems to be wrong with the nursery, it doesn't seem as if they feel that they are unsafe in their home. Then, of course, the home is defamiliarized by the creation of the Veldt in the nursery, and their sense of security in their house disappears. Now, the house in the Veldt becomes a space of potential danger instead of a safe harbor. It's not really that Africa that is in the nursery, it's not really that unsettles Lydia. It's the screams she hears and that she notes sound familiar. It's those screams that are associated with violence and painful death and are human in nature that leads to Lydia's discomfort and even fear of the nursery. But even then, she doesn't quite comprehend what she's hearing. Because what she's actually hearing is the results of the children's repeated fantasies or even rehearsals of their parents' death. But even though she doesn't understand that what she's hearing, those screams that are so familiar, are actually hers and George's, the fact that there is human screaming adds a hint of potential danger to the African scenario that the kids have called up in the nursery. Now, in the story, only the nursery is actually changed and defamiliarized. But those changes in that one room lead George and Lydia to finally question whether their high-tech home is the best idea. The familiarization of the defamiliarization of the nursery leads them to look at other effects that the house is having on the family, and they begin to recognize that they might be overly dependent on the house. For example, Lydia expresses feelings of worthlessness because the house does the cooking and the cleaning and to some degree, as we're going to talk about, caring for the children, so she feels worthless. Now, it is interesting to note, though, that they haven't reached the point, really, of understanding exactly how deep and serious this reliance on technology has become, because they only consider turning off the entire house for a short vacation. They do not, in the course of the story, consider abandoning that lifestyle, simply taking a vacation from it. But at least they're beginning to have an understanding that the technology is not necessarily a good thing. Now we'll turn to talking about the people as the source of evil that leads to horror. And a natural place to begin is the children, because after all, they are the ones who commit murder. One factor that contributes to the children being a source of horror is that they're clearly very spoiled. Now, it's obvious that their parents are financially affluent. Did you notice at the beginning of the story that it says that they paid $30,000 for that high-tech house? And of course, to us, that seems like you couldn't buy a shack for $30,000. But you have to keep in mind that in 1950, when this story was written, the average house sold for less than $9,000. So they paid more than three times the amount that the average house sells for in order to have that house. And in order to be able to afford that, they must be reasonably affluent. And the kids are clearly used to getting anything their hearts desire. And they're given an extraordinary amount of freedom in their movements. They call in and say whether they're going to be home for dinner. They don't ask if it's okay if they miss dinner. And the fact that they would even ask if they could rocket off to New York City by themselves indicates that they're used to being able to come and go as they please. They're also really emotionally manipulative. Now, to some degree, all children are, and there's nothing wrong with that. If we think back to our own childhoods, we remember that we all knew how to get around our parents and get our own way. And it never crossed our mind that manipulating our parents' emotions was a bad thing to do. But that's normal. We know from Jean Piaget's work with childhood developmental stages that children are by nature self-centered. It's the way our brains are wired when we're born. And it takes years to grow out of believing that the world and everything in it were designed specifically for us. And that realization doesn't happen all at once. So the things that we do to manipulate our parents as children, we don't see it as emotional manipulation. But that doesn't mean it isn't. It doesn't mean that children don't do it and aren't good at it. And certainly these children are particularly adept at manipulating their parents emotionally. Now, we realize by the end of the story that these kids value the gratification of their immediate needs more than they value people. It's not as if the nursery is the only enjoyable thing in these kids' lives, or even the only form of recreation available to them. Turning it off for a little while is really no different than our telling kids that they can't watch TV for a week or two. Yeah, the kids might get mad, but most of those kids wouldn't even consider killing someone over it, especially not a family member. But these children are so angry that they aren't allowed to go to New York by themselves that they begin using the nursery to fantasize about or even plot and rehearse their parents' death. And even if it wasn't a rehearsal but just a fantasy, it becomes something that they are in reality willing to do when their parents threaten to turn off the nursery, because they would rather kill their parents than lose the nursery altogether. I don't think it's unreasonable to assume that if they would kill their parents to get their way, there isn't much that they wouldn't do to anyone who stood between them and the gratification of their immediate material desires. They're also very cold and unfeeling. It takes a cold heart to commit a painful murder of a loved one, and these children seem to be as cold as the technology they depend on. For example, when the psychiatrist returns to the house after the parents are killed, the children are actually sipping tea while their parents' bodies are being eaten by lions in the same room. Okay. It takes a really cold person to be able to do that, even if that person wasn't ultimately the source of the violence, as these children are. But when the psychiatrist comes back, they show no remorse, they aren't afraid, they aren't shocked, they're not showing any grief. They're able to just sit there and calmly offer the psychiatrist a cup of tea while their parents are being eaten within at least visible distance. That's cold. Pardon me. A lot of what happens in this story occurs because the children feel entitled to have what they want. Now, we all want what we want when we want it. That's just human nature. But most of us understand that, as the Rolling Stones saying, you can't always get what you want. That's where a sense of entitlement comes in. People who have a sense of entitlement believe that they are owed whatever they want simply because they want it. The concept of earning something or going without it is just completely beyond them. They are entitled to the fulfillment of their desires simply because they do us all the favor of existing, I guess. And anything that stands in their way or denies them their wishes is just wrong. And it needs to be dealt with and corrected or eliminated altogether. And this sense of entitlement that Bradbury predicted in 1950 is something that we definitely see all around us in people these days. Okay, now let's talk about the parents in the Veldt. On page 264, George says nothing is too good for our children. Well, of course parents feel that way. We all want the very best for our children. But most parents temper that desire for their kids to have everything with the knowledge that one of the things that isn't too good for their children is learning to grow toward healthy, responsible adulthood. It's always easier for parents to give a kid the box of cookies than it is to listen to the kid scream and throw a fit. For one thing, there's the auditory disturbance of listening to those high-pitched screams, but it goes far beyond that. we want to give our children whatever they want or need. There is almost a compulsion to make them happy. And we forget that one of the things that we give children is the answer no. And if we are loving, giving parents, we give them the answer no, even if it would be much easier for us personally if we said yes. George and Lydia, in attempting to give their kids everything, actually withhold from them the guidance and discipline that children really need. Now, I have provided a link to a short, like half-hour movie of the Veldt that was on TV, and you're not required to watch it, but I encourage you to watch it. It stays really close to the print story in most ways, but one thing it does is it adds the parents' use of technology to entertain their children. When the psychiatrist visits Lydia and George in the film, when he comes over to look at the nursery before the parents are hurt, in the film, he points out that the parents don't spend any time taking their kids on picnics or playing ball with them in the yard or sharing any form of recreation as a family. They let the technology do that for them. And technology, of course, never says no. And that contributes to the kids' sense of entitlement. And of course, the lack of sharing fun as a family helps to contribute to their coldness. If all you interact with their machines, you will eventually become like the machine. And that's a frequent theme in science fiction horror, that people will lose their humanity if they are surrounded by too much technology. Now, while George and Lydia believe that they're loving the children because they think nothing is too good for them, as I said before, they're actually withholding love for the sake of convenience and comfort for themselves, as well as the kids. As I said, no one likes to say no to their kids. No one wants to see their children experience a moment's sadness. It's hard on parents to see their kids unhappy. It's as hard on the parents as it is on the kids to be unhappy. But good parents learn to accept that difficulty because they know that love means saying no sometimes. That kind of pain that is associated with saying no to our children is part of the job, and we accept that when we decide to have children. But we see George and Lydia immediately caving into their children's tantrum when they shut down the nursery. Lydia says, "Oh, turn it on for just a few more minutes," and George, of course, does it. And no, it's not that they don't care. This couple clearly cares a great deal about their children and has their best interests in mind. It's not that. It's that they're not willing to accept the role of being the bad guy when that's what children really need. And that is a role that a lot of parents have problems accepting, because nobody wants to appear to be the bad guy to their kids. And all of this is part of George and Lydia's not accepting the fact that there is a difference between giving in to a child's wishes and giving the child what he or she really needs. Children need limits. They need structure. They need to be guided toward responsible adulthood. And saying no to children and dealing with their response when you do is part of guiding children to adulthood. No, it isn't easy. Because as I said, we want our children to have everything, because our love for them is so boundless and so complete. Disciplined children requires self-discipline and strength. But George and Lydia are not looking at what will lead to happy adulthood for their kids. They only see what would give them an idyllic childhood And sometimes the things that would give us an idyllic childhood are not the same things that would lead us to a happy adulthood. And sometimes our adulthood is actually sacrificed to our parents' desire to give us idyllic childhoods. And of course, we would be remiss not to talk about the technology and how it creates to the horror. Um, Questions about the dangers of science and technology have been around since the scientific method was first used. And as we discussed earlier in the semester, that was in the 17 and 1800s. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein was published in 1802, and it's very definitely a product of the age of enlightenment, um, of which the discovery, is that the right word, of the scientific method was definitely a part of that. One important question that Mary Shelley's Frankenstein raises is who is responsible for the results of scientific discoveries? The scientist? The people who use the discoveries for various methods? And of course, this would have been a real issue in 1950 when the Veldt was written. We saw in Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue that the invention and dropping of the atomic bomb and the rise of the Cold War led to countless horror movies about mutant creatures that were created by radiation. Now, there aren't any mutants in the Veldt, but the short story does lead to questions as to whether what appears to be helpful technology can actually be very dangerous. Something else we need to remember is that 1950 was in that period that directly followed World War II. And the period after World War II was one in which both U.S. corporate profits and wages were rising, proving that it can be done. And families were able to achieve the American dream of owning their own house. It was a time also of increasing use of machines in the home, because as people moved to the suburbs and bought their own houses, things like the neighborhood laundromat and the corner deli ceased to be factors in their lives, and they used machines to replace these. There were, at that time, futuristic exhibits at county fairs that promised even more miracles brought about technology that were supposedly just around the corner. I saw some of these in the early 60s, and the future that they predicted for us, of course, never came about, because that future was supposed to be largely marked by increased leisure time. That hasn't happened. All the technology has done is it has allowed employers to extend our work time so that we end up doing a lot more work at home because they can get in touch with us 24 hours a day. Now, of course, that doesn't happen in the academy. So, I'm fairly lucky in that teachers have always worked 24 hours a day, but it's not because of their bosses. But that life of leisure that we were promised, that certainly never materialized. If anything, because of the technology that we have, we're busier and our lives are more hectic and more stressful than they were. But even as early as 1950, technology was becoming an increasingly important part of day-to-day lives. It wasn't just the national issue of the atomic bomb. It was also the machines that were becoming increasingly available, and their use was becoming increasingly widespread. Now, an important thing to notice about what the Veldt says about technology is that the technology itself is not dangerous. It's how the people use the technology that leads to danger. And even the most helpful, useful technology can be dangerous if used improperly. We see this now in terms of smartphones. Smartphones are great. They really do bring the ability for people to get in touch with you, for you to get in touch with people, and even for you to be able to access an entire world of information at your fingertips in a way that's very, very portable. And how could you ask for anything better? But there's a downside and a danger. A student a couple of years ago told me that he was stationed at Nellis. And there is a rule at Nellis that people can't bring electronics to meals. And in recent years, according to this student, people come to meals in the dining hall and they don't talk to each other at all because they've kind of forgotten how to interact with people around them as opposed to people that they're interacting with in the cell phone. So the technology is great, but sometimes how we use it is not all that great. One of the dangers that the Veldt points out, and this ties into what we've been talking about, is the danger of becoming dependent on the technology. In the Veldt, the entire family has grown so dependent on technology that the very idea of even brushing their own teeth and tying their own shoes dismays the children. And it's particularly dangerous, of course, when an entire society becomes dependent on technology. Even science fiction writers didn't foresee the invention and widespread use of the internet. And as a society, we have allowed ourselves to become so dependent on technology that a cyber attack by a foreign power could wipe out our electrical power, our communication systems, our transportation systems, some of the most basic functions that we need to survive as a culture. And not only could they wipe them out, but because we didn't retain any kind of an analog system as a backup, it could take an estimated 10 years to restore those services. And meanwhile, the rest of the world would move on without us. Now, that's a dangerous dependence on technology. Now, well, the Veldt reveals some other technological dangers. The final one that we're going to talk about is the tendency of technology to replace people and make them obsolete. This is brought up mainly by Lydia, who bemoans the fact that she feels so worthless. Now, keep in mind that the culture of the 1950s would have played a strong role in Lydia's feelings. Because in those days, women generally did not have careers or even jobs outside the home. And even the helpful household machinery that was available in the 1950s, like washers and dryers and so forth, they don't operate by themselves. Okay? They need a human being to operate them. And to a large degree, of course, still do. But the Veldt looks into an unspecified futuristic period when humans are not needed to run machines in terms of doing more than just pressing a button, and they can even set up timers so that they don't have to do that in order to have dinner cooked or the house cleaned or the kids taken care of. Now, we know that homes are only now moving in the direction of our being able to control them technologically. But a lot of aspects of the workplace have changed because technology has replaced human beings. There are entire fields that once required very specialized training and talent, and they've been completely disappeared because they've been replaced by technology. And something that's a little frightening that we don't think about too often is that the internet has made it possible to centralize operations for the financial sector as well as the retail sector of our economy. Locally owned banks and businesses have all but disappeared because of the centralization that's made possible by the immediacy of the internet. And with that move, with the disappearance of local businesses, the importance of individual consumers has disappeared entirely. Back in the 1950s and even into the early 1990s, there was a very familiar and common saying that the customer is always right. And we know that that attitude doesn't exist anymore. In fact, the individual consumer means absolutely nothing to American corporations. So, as a result, in the name of increasing profits, the quality of goods has deteriorated to a shocking degree, and service is an obsolete concept because losing any one customer doesn't mean that much to these large corporations, which are they're able to exist only because of the centralization that's been facilitated by technology and particularly the internet. And when we combine that availability of technology and its capability to centralize business to the point that individual consumers mean nothing, when we combine that with the sense of entitlement that is characteristics of many people that were raised in the 1980s and beyond, we produce an economic culture that's marked by rudeness and refusal of anybody to take responsibility. And that attitude extends from CEOs all the way down to the lowest level clerks. Then we add to that the fact that laws that once protected consumers have been modified to benefit the almighty corporations. It's gotten to the point that making any kind of a purchase ranges from being a waste of money to being actually dangerous. And the consumer has no recourse because the laws have been rewritten in favor of the corporations. And all of this is enabled because of the technology and the internet. But as the story points out, it's not the internet's fault. The internet is not to blame. It's how we use it that is problematic, because technology is neutral. So, if we take into consideration the various weaknesses of human nature, questions are raised in this story, as they are in Lovecraft's work, as to whether knowledge is always a good thing. In Lovecraft's work, even in young Goodman Brown, and other kinds of horror, including the Veldt, the question is posed, is knowledge always good, or are there things we are better off not knowing? And that's definitely a question that we can ponder as we move on. So that's all that I have to share with you about the Veldt. I'm interested in hearing what you thought about this story on the discussion boards. And I, of course, will be replying on the discussion boards every now and then, because you know I can never resist throwing in my 2 cents worth. But if you have any questions or any comments that you want to make other than on the discussion board, just email me from an account other than Canvas, at deborah.okie@csn.edu. Thanks so much for listening to this presentation. I hope that it helps make the story a little bit more enjoyable for you and points out some things that maybe you haven't noticed. Have a good day.